Hi, I'm Pastor David Yosses of Epiphany Lutheran Church in Mount Vernon, Virginia. Welcome to this second video in our book series on David Bentley Hart's book, That All Shall Be Saved. I want to remind you to visit our webpage at epiphanylutheran.org/saved. You can sign up there to receive email notifications about new videos in the series and other events that we'll be doing. And if you have questions or comments you'd like us to address in future videos, please send them to our email address at saved@epiphanylutheran.org. I hope you've had a chance to look at the introduction to the book. It's pages 1 through 6 in this edition, and we talked about it in the first video last week. If you have had that chance, you will have noticed a couple of things. Number one, Hart's writing style. He uses a lot of big, fancy vocabulary words, more than I find in almost any author that I read. My high school English teacher will probably haunt me for saying this, but do not feel obliged to go and look up every word that you don't recognize in the dictionary. You can usually get the gist of what Hart's saying without it. The other thing you probably have noticed is the tone. Hart is very argumentative. He is completely comfortable with saying, I'm 100% right, and anybody who disagrees with me either doesn't understand the argument or they're just hopelessly confused. And to be honest, I know that style turns a lot of people off. Personally, I find it kind of refreshing. It sort of reminds me of Martin Luther telling off the Pope. Luther had this way of when he disagreed with someone and thought that their teaching was harmful, he would insult them, sometimes very colorfully, and sometimes Luther would say things that were regrettable. I find I appreciate the honesty and the directness of it and the passion with which Hart thinks that this is just really an important issue for the church to get right. And so he is sort of argumentative, and if that's a problem for you, I would just urge you to try to look past it and appreciate his passion for what it is. What I'd like to do in this video is to give you a short overview of the structure of the book and then a more detailed overview of the first chapter. So there's two introductory chapters, one called Framing the Question, how Hart sees the question of hell and eternal punishment and what's important about it. And then a second introductory chapter, which we'll do in the next video, called Doubting the Answers, where he looks at the traditional classic Catholic and Protestant approaches to this question and why he has some issues with both. Then there are 4 longer sections called Meditations. Each one is a more sustained argument about a particular question related to the doctrine of hell and eternal salvation. And then there's a final section, which is a short conclusion, but there's also, in my paperback edition, there's a preface. It's the Roman numeral pages at the very beginning of this, and that was written as a response to criticisms to the first edition of the book. And that, I think, will work really well if we save it for the end and use it as a conclusion. So that's what we'll do. So today, what I'd like to do is to preview the first chapter of the book, Framing the Question. It's pages 9 to 32 in the paperback edition I have here. And there are 3 sections. So section 1, pages 9 to 17, Hart tells a little bit of his own personal story. And he says, when he was 14 years old, he was reading a book of the legends of the 4th century Egyptian desert fathers. When I was 14, I was reading C.S. Lewis, and I thought I was weird. That's probably how Hart got such a vocabulary. He was reading a lot of really obscure stuff at an early age. But when he was 14, he was reading these legends of the Egyptian desert fathers. And these are spiritual teachers who were some of the early monks and hermits in the 4th century Egyptian church. And he reads the story about a certain holy man called Abbe Macarius. And according to the story, you can believe it if you like, Hart says there's a certain holy man named Abbe Macarius who is out for a walk one day in the desert, and he discovers a talking skull. And the skull belonged in life to, he says, a high priest of the Egyptian pagan religion in the time before Christianity. And since he didn't know Jesus, he of course wound up in hell. And the skull tells Abbe Macarius what hell is like, and Abbe Macarius is shocked at the suffering that is happening, and he's filled with compassion. And he says, what a shame it was that this man was ever even born in the first place, to have to spend eternity suffering for something that he had no control over. And out of compassion for this poor man, Abbe Macarius buries the skull so the poor dead man can rest in peace, if that's even possible for somebody who's in hell. Now, Hart says, even at the age of 14, I knew that this story was fake. That this story reminded him of like one of those horror movies where the plot is so bad that it's not even scary. And he said, this is a story that was probably meant to scare children, but it's got so many theological holes in it, you can't possibly take it seriously. For example, Abbe Macarius is much more compassionate than the God who insists on punishing this poor man and sending him to hell forever for something he had no control over. And if we take Abbe Macarius seriously, when he says, what a shame it was that this poor man was even born, well, we can understand that, but God had something to do with that. God chose to create this person, and to create this person within a universe where many people, like Abbe Macarius, would wind up in hell through no fault of their own. How can we love a God who would choose to create people and then sentence them to eternal suffering? He said, that just doesn't make any sense. I can't believe this story. And Hart says, by chance, a week or so later, he was attending Sunday services at the Episcopal Church in Maryland, where he grew up. And the priest in his sermon made reference to this exact same story. And the priest found a great deal of spiritual truth and wisdom in the story. And Hart talks about some of the things there. And he said, this sermon did not change my mind at all. I continued to believe, and still believe, that the picture of God that it presents is something that no Christian could possibly accept. And he said, he really started to wrestle as a young man with whether Christianity really believes in a God that's as compassionate and merciful as we think God is. He eventually finds helpful some Eastern Orthodox theologians that he mentions on pages 16 and 17. You may not recognize the names, people like Isaac of Nineveh. They're very important Eastern Orthodox tradition. And you can find similar people saying similar things in both Catholic and Protestant Western Christian traditions as well. What he learns from them, he said, was helpful to say, God has only one disposition towards us, and that is a disposition of love. God is always loving and compassionate. We sometimes are so turned in on ourselves that we experience God's love and mercy as painful. But that's on us. It's not on God. God doesn't change. Think of a child who's throwing a tantrum and they've locked themselves in their room and they're crying and screaming, and the parent is knocking at the door saying, "Can I please come in? It's going to be okay. Can I help? How can I calm you down?" And the more compassionate the parent is, the louder the child screams. And these theologians sort of see hell in that way. God is trying to reach us with compassion and mercy, and sometimes we just don't want to hear it. And psychologically, Hart says, we can understand that. Some of us have been there as parents. Some of us have been there as that child. We can understand that this is kind of a plausible way of looking at things. But Hart said he still found himself asking, even if God is always compassionate, can we really reject that compassion forever? Is that really possible? And so Hart said he found himself asking two questions. The less important question is, does it even make sense to say that a finite creature who lives on Earth for 70, 80 years, or maybe a little more, can make a decision that will have eternal consequences for all of eternity to reject God? Is that possible? And then the second question, the more important question, is even if that is possible, even if that does make sense, can we love a God who would create a world in which that kind of eternal rejection and therefore eternal suffering and torment is even possible. Is God really good? So in this first section, what Hart is doing is he's saying, this is how I came to this almost instinctive reaction, that there's a real problem with the idea of eternal hell as a punishment from God and how we reconcile that with what we believe about the mercy and compassion of God. Maybe that's your intuition as well. Maybe your intuition is something else. But this is where Hart is coming from, and that's what he tries to explain through a bit of his own story in this first section of chapter 1. The second section, which runs from pages 18 to 28, I think can get really confusing. Because it's not immediately obvious what Hart's point is. It takes the whole 10 pages for him to really get there. And I think it's very easy to get lost in the weeds of this section quickly. So let me try to say very simply what I think the very straightforward point that Hart is making. From Hart's perspective, it's intuitively obvious that a God of grace and mercy, a God of infinite love, would not create beings in order to condemn them to eternal suffering, even if they deserved it. If a human being acted in this way, we would have no problem identifying that person as cruel and sadistic and maybe even evil. And so Hart says, why is it that so many Christians think that they must believe this terrible thing about God? Why do we think we have to believe it? That's the point he really wants to get at in this section. How did Christianity get to the point where we think that hell is, even if it involves God being or seeming to be quite cruel in ways that we would immediately understand that about if it were a human person, why do we think it's so important, or many Christians think it's so important, to attribute this to God? And yes, God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. But isn't the point that God's ways are supposed to be better than our ways? God's not supposed to be worse, especially from a Christian perspective. Jesus certainly does not act as a merciless judge. And if Jesus is God made flesh, then God is like Jesus. How did we come to think of God as being so cruel? Now, Hart thinks ultimately his intuitive understanding is that hell as eternal punishment cannot be reconciled with who the Christian God is, if you really think about it. That's what he's going to walk us through in this book. For him, this intuitive understanding is just obviously correct. It's kind of up there with the world is round and the moon landing really happened. And if you're arguing with somebody who thinks that the earth is flat or that the moon landing was fake, you can present arguments for why they're wrong all you want. You're really probably not going to convince them because there's something else that's going on, something that makes them want to believe that the standard wisdom everybody is telling them is a lie. You want to really get at why do you not trust the sort of consensus view of everybody else? Why are you so suspicious? There's got to be something else going on here. And in this second section of chapter 1, Hart kind of starts and stops arguments, trying to draw our attention to this underlying question. Why do we think it's so important to attribute this cruel vision of hell and eternal suffering to God? Why is that so important? And Hart says, I can tell you hell doesn't exist because of X, Y, and Z. A school of theology that you've never heard of is going to say, well, hell must exist because of A, and I'll respond with B, and they'll respond with C. But wait a minute, none of this really matters, Hart says. We have to get to the core spiritual question about why people think this is so important. In the middle of page 18, he even says, what I've just written for the first half of this page probably makes no sense to you whatsoever, and that's fine. It probably shouldn't make sense to you yet. at this stage of the book. Um, so don't get bogged down when he, in this section, starts going off on tangents and starts quoting Dante and everything else. What he's really trying to get at, what he's trying to get at through a number of different things, but he's trying to pose the question, why has it been so important for Christians to think that they need to believe in hell, even if we find that teaching to be appalling and frightening? Part of the answer, Hart thinks, is we've come to think, for a variety of historical reasons, that, well, we have to believe in hell to be a good Christian. It's required. So we come up with arguments to convince ourselves that God is not nearly so much of a monster as God seems to be. Because we're afraid that if we pull one brick out of the structure of our faith, the whole thing's going to come crashing down. So part of what Hart wants to do in this book is to say, look, there's a long Christian tradition of believing that God ultimately will save everyone. And so there's nothing to fear here. You can let go of some of the ideas that you've been taught that you have to believe. It's not going to collapse your faith. It's actually going to make it better. Now, you may agree or disagree with Hart at the end, but that's what he thinks he's doing. And that's what he's trying to set up here in this section. The other part of Hart's answer is he tries to name what else gets distorted when we get the doctrine of hell wrong. And here, I think I would make the point a little differently than Hart. I think we're more or less on the same page. But the way I would put it is, human beings have come to think that righteous violence is necessary. Righteous violence, Hart doesn't use that word, that's my word. Righteous violence is necessary for human civilization and human community to exist, you know? There are bad guys with guns out there, and what's going to save us is a good guy with a gun. Righteous violence. And we assume, because that's our experience, that righteous violence is essential to making the world work. We assume that God also rules the universe through righteous violence against those who deserve it. In my view, and I think Hart would agree with this, the whole biblical story is the record of Israel's gradual discovery that God is not like that there is in fact no violence in God, that the communion of persons who is God, the human community of the people of God that God is calling into existence, is not constituted by righteous violence in any way. This is a story that culminates in Jesus, the God who becomes human, who allows himself to be crucified by his enemies, rather than inflict violence to defend himself against his enemies. And so Jesus brings us into a world where we're set free from the righteous violence that shapes the current hellscape of our world. If we think that God is violent and retributive, we are projecting our desire for righteous violence onto God. But in fact, that is not who God is. And the more that we can let go of that projection, the more faithful we will be to Scripture, the more faithful we will be to Jesus, the more we will experience the love and the presence of God. What Hart is trying to communicate in this section is he doesn't think this book is going to convince anybody any more than the arguments and evidence are going to convince somebody who thinks the world is flat that they're wrong. What he is hoping is that this book will give us permission to imagine that God might actually be better than what we've been taught to think. That both Scripture and careful reflection will point us to a God who rules by mercy and compassion and not by condemnation and punishment. And that's way bigger than just the question about wondering what's going to happen after we die and is there a hell? It's this more fundamental question. Why do we believe that God must, in the end, punish people forever? What does that say about God? What does that say about the life that God is calling us to? That's the point of the second section. The third and final section is much shorter, and Hart is basically making this same move, but on the more personal level. Do we think that do we believe in hell because we actually are convinced by the arguments for it? Or do we believe in hell because we want to believe in it? And Hart says, well, maybe there are some people who actually get joy out of the fact that other people are going to go to hell. Some people might be happy to learn that heaven is a gated community that keeps the riffraff out, but lets people like them in. Hart says, if you're actually really that indifferent to the fate of your neighbors, maybe you shouldn't assume that you're one of the lucky ones who gets to go to that gated community heaven. But it's really not his place to judge. But in any case, Hart thinks most people who think that they believe in hell actually don't want to. Actually would prefer to believe in a God of mercy, and deep down act as if they do believe in a God of mercy, even if they've convinced themselves intellectually that they believe it. They certainly don't act like it. Most people are like Abbe Macarius. They have a degree of humanity about them. And what Hart wants to do in this last section is sort of to give us permission to actually let ourselves feel that compassion and actually think carefully about the question about whether belief in eternal hell actually makes sense. So I'd encourage you to take a read for this first chapter. Make sure that you've signed up for things at epiphanylutheran.org/saved. If you have questions or comments or reactions, please send them to saved@epiphanylutheran.org. I'll try to respond. As we go through this, we'll try to set up a group discussion at some point, perhaps over Zoom, and we'll also let you know if you've signed up by email when that will be. But until then, take care, God bless, and happy reading.